Okay, well, we're moving on now to the ACT Party speaker. So Stephen Whittington is number 8 on the ACT Party list and is the candidate for Wellington Central. Currently works in a tax team in a corporate law firm, and has just recently finished his studies at Victoria University, where he was a champion debater as well. So welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Max, and thanks NZUSA for inviting me to speak on behalf of the ACT Party here today. It's great to be standing in front of one of the few voluntary organisations which represents students in New Zealand, and I'm proud to be from a party which has extended that to all student associations and enabled students to determine for themselves whether they wish to associate with the Students' Association. You've asked me to outline ACT's policy on tertiary education, and the way I intend to go about this is, first of all, to outline the general principles that the ACT Party takes to determining whether it's appropriate for the government to spend taxpayers' money, and then outline the implications of those principles in terms of tertiary education. So the most basic thing about government expenditure, which everyone acknowledges, is if the government's to spend money, it's first got to take it off someone. And so whenever the government spends money, it's taking them off taxpayers. And there's generally two plausible justifications for government expenditure. The first is that it increases efficiency, and that justifies government expenditure on things like public goods, like police force and army, those sort of things. The other justification for government expenditure is that it advances social equity, that it provides, for example, a minimum standard of living for all New Zealanders, and on that basis welfare expenditure is justified. And that's essentially the approach that the ACT Party takes. In respect of tertiary education particularly, the amount that the government currently spends undermines both economic efficiency and social equality. So let's consider the kind of people who are more likely to attend tertiary education. So the people who receive tertiary education are typically fortunate. So they've typically gone to a good school, they've typically been motivated, they've typically received good grades, and they've earned the opportunity to get a tertiary qualification at a tertiary institute. And when people receive a tertiary qualification, they receive a substantial private benefit. So among those who have tertiary qualifications, their rate of unemployment is significantly lower. They receive much higher wages as a result of getting that tertiary qualification. Now, the OECD calculates figures to determine what the value of receiving a tertiary education is. And the net present value, so the value today of receiving a tertiary education in New Zealand, and that's regardless of if it's at a polytechnic, a private training institute, or university, works out, on average, at about $70,000. So that's the value today, over the course of your life, of getting a tertiary qualification, on average. The other great thing about the OECD figures is they break it down between what you personally benefit and what the public benefits. And the personal benefit of that $70,000 amounts to about $45,000. So it would be fair to say that the main beneficiary of tertiary education and a tertiary qualification is the individual who receives that qualification themselves. So that's who benefits from tertiary education. Now let's consider who actually pays for tertiary education. So in general terms, approximately 75% of the tuition costs of a tertiary qualification are borne by taxpayers. And if your parents happen to earn below a certain threshold, or if you're older than 25, the government in addition may give you a student allowance that you never have to pay back. And even if your parents earn lots of money, and even if you in fact yourself earn lots of money, you can take out a student loan to pay the costs of your tertiary qualification. You can take out a student loan for your living expenses, and that loan is never charged interest. So when you combine the fact that the loan has no interest component to it, the real value that you pay back is significantly less than the amount that you've borrowed. And in addition, the government doesn't even manage to collect all the money that it loans out. So the actual performance of that loan book is particularly bad. So, and that's especially the case as regards university, where the costs are generally higher than some of the other courses that are offered in the tertiary qualification area. So in terms of the average amount of subsidy that a person who studies in a tertiary institute receives from the taxpayer amounts to about $15,000 per year per person. So to put all that in very simple terms and to explain why I first talked about who benefits and then talked about who paid, is that the current tertiary education system transfers resources from those who don't have the opportunity to study in a tertiary institute to those who do. And on average, given that those who do not have that opportunity tend to be poorer and those who do tend to be richer, what the tertiary education system at the moment does is actually transfer money from the poor to the rich. We are in effect taxing people who leave school at 17 and try and find a job to pay for the education of people who become lawyers, who become doctors, or who become engineers. Now, from a policy of fairness, of social equity, the ACT Party doesn't agree with that. We don't think it's fair to tax the least well off in order to fund the education of those who become the most well off. And so this has several implications for our policies. The first is that we would end interest-free student loans. We would charge interest on those student loans, and we'd try and make sure that the loan book was actually policed sufficiently, that the government actually got the money that people owe to it. Now, there is one legitimate point that I should recognise that could be made in response to the argument that I've just put out. And that's that although it's true that, you know, as a matter of fact, the tertiary education funding system does transfer money from those on low incomes to those on high, when you actually, you know, become your lawyer or your doctor or your engineer or whatever, you pay higher taxes, and that's essentially how you pay for tertiary education. And there is some merit to that argument. But I want to demonstrate the benefit of charging interest and having lower rates of tax rather than paying high rates of tax and having no interest. So when I left Victoria University, and I should note I actually still have a couple of papers to finish on my BA, so I'm still technically an enrolled student. So when I left university as regards my law degree, I had a loan of about $45,000. Now it just so happens that as a graduate in a commercial law firm, that's about what I earn. So applying an interest rate of about 5% to my loan balance would be equivalent to reducing my taxes in terms of my net position by 5 percentage points. So I wouldn't care. If you said to me, would you rather pay 5% interest and have 5 percentage point lower taxes, I'd say there's no financial difference to me in the short term. But what's the financial difference to me in the long term? Well, over the course of my life, I'll pay those lower taxes in exchange for a portion of my life paying higher interest on my student loan. But in addition, there's very different incentive effects. If the taxes on me are lower, I'm encouraged to work. If taxes are high, I'm discouraged from working. If interest is chargeable on my loan, I'm encouraged to pay it back as soon as possible. If interest isn't, I'm discouraged from paying it back as soon as possible. In fact, people who make more than the minimum repayments are doing something that's financially silly. You shouldn't do that, because essentially, you aren't allowing inflation to eat away the value of your loan. So as a piece of advice to any student watching this, never make more than your minimum repayments, because the reality is it doesn't make financial sense. And that's the structure we've got ourselves into with our student loan system. We encourage people to borrow lots of money, and then we don't provide them any benefit from repaying it earlier, other than there is a slight benefit from repaying it earlier if you pay in a lump sum amount, but people have looked at the figures and it only makes sense to do that if you're going to pay off your loan in the next 2 years. So it's quite interesting, this issue, because, you know, the NZUSA website, for example, is chock full of statistics and ticking student debt calculators and all that sort of stuff. And when NZUSA looks at those numbers, I assume you say, isn't this terrible how much debt we have? We need to be more generous. Whereas when I see those numbers, I say, aren't those debt numbers terrible? And given that the return to the government on the loan book is about 50%, taxpayers are in fact massively subsidising the education of those who will end up earning more as a result of that. So NZUSA generally want people, the government, to be more generous with other people's money, whereas I want to stop that debt pile up by encouraging people to first take out a lower amount of loan if possible, work throughout university as I did, or alternatively repay that loan as soon as possible when they graduate. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of policy is what some people call the fee maxima policy, but the name's actually technically been changed from what I understand, so that National could say that they changed the policy because some National supporters didn't support it. But essentially, the way it works now, from what I understand, is that there is still a limitation on the rate of increase in the fees, but there aren't specific limitations on the total value of the fees as occurred under the previous policy. So within a context where you're not charging interest on loans, that policy actually makes sense. Because if you don't charge interest on loans, and if you allow fees to go up, what people will do is they'll borrow more, the government collects about 50% of that money back, and so if you don't limit the amount of fees, then what's actually happening is taxpayers just end up getting hurt more. So if we're not going to get rid of zero interest student loans, then we've got to have a fee maxima policy. But the actual implications of that policy itself are particularly destructive. And I want to talk through exactly why that is. So one of the things that the government does is it caps enrolment numbers. And it says if you take more students than this particular number, you don't receive any additional government funding for each of those students. And when you combine the fact that the government doesn't subsidise that particular student with the fact that the university itself can't determine the proper fees for that particular student, a lot of marginal students in New Zealand, a lot of students that the university is considering, should we take one more student, actually loses the money. So the marginal student in a lot of university courses, for example, loses the university money. Now what's the implication of that? It means if the university can cut the number of students they accept into courses, the amount of money that they have available for research programs and the like actually increases. And that's why you're seeing universities impose greater restrictions on the people who can go to university. They're lifting the NCA credits that you need, they're lifting the qualifications that you need to get into tertiary education in the first place. Now, that wouldn't be too bad if the quality of secondary schooling across New Zealand was equal for everyone, but it's not. The reality is if you live in the zone for Auckland Grammar, you're going to get a really decent education. If you live in the zone for James Cook High School, you go to a school where the police are stationed to protect you. And the quality of those educations are very different. And again, unfortunately, those differences in the quality of education come back to the amount of money you have. Buying a house in the Auckland zone is expensive, in the Auckland Grammar zone is expensive. Owning a house or renting in the James Cook High zone isn't. So by lifting university entrance requirements, which is a result of the effective fee maxima policy and the fact that the government doesn't fund on a per student basis after you've reached your enrolment cap, what's actually happening is the standards are rising, and that is acting to actually lock out a lot of people who should have the opportunity to get tertiary education, because it's making the school they go to more important than whether they're actually willing to work within tertiary education. And that's really damaging, because it means that those who have access to good schools, who are typically the rich, are also the ones who are more likely to get into tertiary education, and that's really tragic. So while, this may not fit the stereotype of the ACT Party, it's actually precisely in the interests of fairness that the ACT Party has the education policy that it does. We don't think that when the prime beneficiary is the individual, that taxpayers should subsidise tertiary education to the degree that they are. There is a case for subsidisation, and we do support some level of public subsidy, given that there is a public benefit associated with it. But it's certainly not a subsidy that's delivered through a loan scheme, which is essentially anything but a loan scheme. Anyone who offers you money now in respect of the same amount of money being paid back over the next 15 years to the same value is not offering you a loan, they're just offering you money. And that's essentially what our education policy is doing, is it's taxing the poor to fund the future lawyers, doctors, engineers of tomorrow, and we don't think that's fair. So, having told you that we don't support a lot of the stuff that you guys support, I thought I'd briefly outline what I think we would provide. And that's essentially that one of the reasons why New Zealand actually has a low return to education is because our wages are particularly low. You don't actually earn very much. So as I indicated earlier, I earn around $45,000 working as a law graduate. If I went to Australia, I'd earn about 80,000 Australian dollars. So even taking into account, and that's not taking into account the relative strength of their currency. So we don't earn very much. What the ACT Party can do to change that is we can offer you lower taxes, the amount of your net take-home pay is larger. But if you think about it, if you think 20 years in the future, what's going to deliver economic prosperity for New Zealand? So we've tried Labour and National's approach with government spending fluctuating between around 35 and 45%. We haven't had particularly good growth rates in our economy. But there are lots of other countries that provide the way forward. And there are countries that have things like flat taxes, much lower rates of government expenditure, like Singapore, Hong Kong. Estonia. The countries that grow the most are those that reduce the share of GDP that government spends. And that's what the ACT Party supports. So while we can't offer you bribes in the form now, we can offer you bribes in the form later, which is economic prosperity, and that's what the ACT Party supports. I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have for me now.